All right, welcome to the A's Philosophy YouTube channel. I am A's Philosophy, and today I decided I would do kind of more an educational stream um, for people who might be interested. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. This is an important one because this is one I constantly hear the antinomians say teaches basically it teaches sola fide and the idea that works righteousness is being condemned by Christ in this passage, which is found in Luke 18. I hear them say that all the time. They're constantly pointing to this as evidence for sola fide doctrine. Sola fide is Latin for faith alone. And wouldn't you know it, I heard a sermon by R.C. Sproul, who has passed away, but on his organization's website, which continues to this day, Ligonier Ministries, they replay his old sermons. And he was very popular while he was alive. He was probably the most famous Reformed theologian, maybe in the entire world. I wouldn't say the entire. He was one of them. He was up amongst them, and he did a lot to influence the direction of American Protestant evangelical Christianity, specifically of the Reformed persuasion. And even though not all Christians are Reformed, not even most Christians probably don't even know what that means. They don't realize that their beliefs are very much influenced by Reformed theology. I would say the most Protestant denominations. And as a result of that, you will hear Christians of many different denominations and stripes saying that the parable of the Pharisee and the publican teaches faith alone. And they go farther to say that, as I've already said, Jesus is strongly condemning people who want to basically believe that their works are what contribute to their entrance into heaven. So I thought this would be instructive. We're going to listen to the sermon by R.C. Sproul, and I will make comments. I'll try to keep the comments to a minimum. And then after the sermon by R.C. Sproul, we'll kind of do a little bit, maybe if there are people around, we can do a discussion and kind of look at it a little more deeply if that's what people want. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's listen to R.C. Sproul first, and then we will talk about it a little bit more.
We're going to consider the parable this evening that's an exercise in contrast in which Jesus is concerned with two men who are in prayer before God. And the parable is called the parable of the Pharisee who are in prayer before God. Pharisee
Sorry,
and the
just want to
publican,
do
or
it.
sometimes the Pharisee.
Sorry, I did an audio check there. I think the audio is pretty low for R.C. Sproul. I have not figured out how to adjust it higher. I wish I could, but hopefully it's good enough for people who are listening. If not, maybe someone can make a comment. Let me make a note. There we go. All right. All right, let's see if this works.
Pharisee and the tax collector. Let me read it for you briefly. Also, he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. This is a very brief, in fact, simple parable that Jesus gives, but we're told at the beginning of it why he gave it and to whom it was addressed. Notice he said he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and they despised others. If you look at all of the parables of the New Testament,
So I think the key here, and let's take a look at it. And he told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. And a lot of times they will focus on that statement. But I think the key here is to realize that this is very important right here. And viewed others with contempt. So we need to keep that in mind. It's not just that they believe themselves to be righteous. The problem that is ignored by people who want to say this is teaching sola fide is that they're viewing others with contempt. So that needs to be noticed right away.
See recurring themes, one of which we've already noticed is the announcement of the crisis that is impending from the advent of the kingdom of God breaking through in the ministry of Jesus. Another motif that we hear again and again and again is that motif by which Jesus gives sober and serious warnings to those who make professions of faith but do not possess what they profess. The warning assumes the teaching of Jesus that the church is a body of people made up of both wheat and tares, what St. Augustine called a corpus permixtum. That is, the church is a mixed body. It includes true believers, but also those people who make professions of faith who have no authentic faith. And the contrast we see here is perhaps as vivid as Jesus can make it, because the first person that he describes in the parable is the Pharisee. And we know that the Pharisee was a high churchman. The Pharisees were a group among the Jews that began their ministry in the intertestamental period, and they were a group of men who banded together because they were profoundly concerned about the decline in religion among the Jewish people at that time and the neglect of the law of God. And the Pharisees, whose name means set apart ones, committed themselves, in spite of what everybody else was doing as they were being secularized, that they were going to be totally devoted to keeping the law of God in an effort to restore righteousness to the land and godliness to the people. But in a very short period of time, they became so caught up with their desire to be righteous that they soon had confidence in their own obedience to the law rather than learning from the law what the law was designed originally to teach them. The Apostle Paul teaches us in the New Testament that the primary function of the law of God is to act as a mirror, that when we look at that mirror, it reveals to us in the first place the holiness of God and our unholiness in contrast to God. And so
there we have a problem right away that I want to highlight. So according to so we're asking ourselves what R.C Sproul is the function of the law is to function as a mirror to show us the holiness of God and our respective unholiness before God. But is that really the case? Notice how he said, according to Paul in the New Testament, that is the function of the law. But is that what God said the function of the law was in the Old Testament? No. God said the function of the law was to, first of all, bring life, and second of all, to help us understand what God wants us to do in this life, how God wants us to behave. So it can function as a mirror. It's not that it can't, but it's not. The purpose isn't to show us how unholy we are and how incapable of living in accordance with God's will we are. No, its purpose is to show us what God wants us to do, and I'm sure God fully expects us to live according to God's law. So let's just also keep that in mind.
What the law is to be is a schoolmaster to drive us to Christ as we realize that we are not capable of keeping the law.
So here's the problem. This is what Christians are being taught. And, obviously R.C Sproul is quoting from Paul's ideas in Galatians that the law is a schoolmaster to drive us to Christ, to realize how pathetic we are, how vile we are, how incapable we are of actually living according to God's will. But no, God's not going to give us a law that we can't follow. God's not going to say, I want you to do this, but oh, psych, you can't do it. No, God knows we're humans. God has given us a law that we are every bit capable of doing. In fact, in the Old Testament, it says countless people were obeying God's law very perfectly. Now, a lot of them weren't. Most of them weren't, but that doesn't matter. The point is it possible? And the function of the law is not to make us despair at how impossible it is. No, it's not impossible. This is a big problem that Christians have, where they believe this garbage that somehow God's law is impossible to obey. Okay, so that's a very dangerous idea, because if you're not obeying God's law, you're not obeying God. You're not going to heaven. So to say that it's a schoolmaster to make us give up hope in obeying God is an extremely dangerous thing to teach people.
But rather than seeing this mirror, they looked in a mirror that showed them their own righteousness, and they became smug and overconfident in their own moral achievement. And pretty soon, they began to have a spirit of being aloof from everybody else in the land. And one of the insidious doctrines that developed among the Pharisees was the idea of justification by segregation. That is, that a person would become justified in the sight of God as long as they could keep themselves clean from any contact with anybody who in any way was polluted. And we see that here when this Pharisee has the audacity to thank God for his superiority. Now, actually, he's quoting a portion of a prayer that was found in the Talmud among the Jewish people, where the leaders were instructed to thank God for the station in life that they enjoyed, being one of the set apart ones. And so this man thanks God, but not with any sincerity. He said he prayed within himself and perhaps to himself as much as to God, but he did address God, saying, I thank you that I am not like other men. He's saying, in a sense, there, but for your grace go I. These extortioners, adulterers, or even as this miserable tax collector that I see over here in the temple. The tax collector were the lowest form of life among the Jews, among the Haaretz, the people of the earth. They were most despised because they were quislings. They were considered traitors. They made their money by collecting taxes for the oppressive Roman government of the day. And they would often clip the coin a trifle and add to their collections and skim some off the top for themselves as they bled the people dry. And so they were the most hated group of people in the nation. And so here's this Pharisee saying, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, like these extortioners, these adulterers, or this miserable tax collector over there. And I want you to remember, God, that even though your law requires fasting only once a year, I fast twice a week. And I give tithes of all that I possess. I'm sacrificial in my giving. I am the quintessential true religious man. Now, the first thing that we understand about this Pharisee is that he has a seriously distorted understanding of what justification requires. Here's a man who thought that to be justified in the sight of God would be accomplished by one's own achievement of righteousness. Here was a man who added to grace his own merit, who added to faith his own works, adding to the work of Christ his own performance.
So there we have it, essentially. The problem with this Pharisee is that he's, quote, adding his own performance to the idea of salvation. Apparently, according to Sproul, as he will go on, this is the problem. So let's remember that this is what is the, according to Sproul and others like him, what we should take away from this parable is that adding your own works to the work of Christ is worthy of condemnation, not by men but by God. So this is key to understand.
And there are many Christians in the world today who believe in order to be redeemed, in order to be justified, you must have faith, you must have grace, and you must have Christ. But they invariably add something else to the mix. They say, I must have faith plus works. I must have grace plus merit. I must have Christ plus my own righteousness. The Roman Catholic Church, for example, to this.
So imagine that. Imagine thinking that in addition to what Christ did, we actually have to, obey God and, help people and, not commit all kinds of sins. What Sproul is actually arguing here is that if you think you have to obey God to get into heaven, you're wrong. Now, who else taught that? Isn't that what Satan taught? Isn't that the doctrine of the devil? Trying to convince people that they shouldn't obey God? So this is what amazes me. So we actually have to believe what the devil taught to get it into heaven. According to, and again, whether you see the devil as a metaphor or symbolic or as a real figure is irrelevant. The point is that this is the satanic doctrine. So at the end of the day, what Satan wants is disobedience to God. Whether that's a literary character or a real substantive being is beside the point. And this is what Christianity has become. It's become exactly what Satan wants us to believe.
Day teaches that God will never pronounce a man justified until or unless inherent righteousness resides within that person. In other words, one must be sanctified before we may be justified, which is just the opposite of what the New Testament actually teaches and what is reiterated here in this parable. Now, that was just the first problem the Pharisee had. He had a completely mistaken understanding of what it takes to be justified. Let me pause here. Jesus addressed this not to this one man who's just a character in the parable, but he addressed it to all who were standing there who thought that they could be justified by their own righteousness. And by extension, this parable of Jesus is given to the millions of people since and now who still trust in their own achievements and in their own good works to make them right with God. People assume that God grades on a curve. And as long as my sin is not as pernicious as my neighbor, I can be happy about my own performance. The Apostle Paul warned that those who judge themselves by themselves and judge themselves among themselves are not wise. But we look around, and as long as we can find somebody more corrupt than we seem to be, we are at ease in Zion, assuming that our superiority and our achievements will get us past the throne of God's judgment. Other religions say that God has scales of justice, and if our good deeds outweigh our bad deeds, then that will get us into heaven. However, what God requires.
I actually don't think that's true. I don't think if our good deeds outweigh our bad deeds, then we get into heaven, because you can't have bad deeds and get into heaven. You can't be someone who wants to do bad deeds and get it. So you have to be operating purely in the realm of good deeds to get into heaven. If you're doing bad deeds, that means you're disobeying God. You won't be able to get into heaven that way. You can't. God's not going to let people into heaven who are disobedient. So we need to understand that.
Is perfection. His law is holy, and we into heaven. However, what God requires is perfection.
Okay, so R.C. Sproul actually does agree with me that perfection is required to get into heaven. All right, so I spoke a little too soon there.
His law is holy, and we are not. As the psalmist asks, O God, if thou wouldst mark iniquity, who would stand? That's a rhetorical question. The answer is clear. No one of us could possibly pass the bar of God's justice based upon our performance. And so to assume that we are going to enter heaven because we've lived a good life, or tried to live a good life, or lived a better life than others around us, is to be on a fool's errand, to make the most fatal mistake of all. However, the second mistake perhaps is even worse than the first, because even if it were the case that we could get into heaven by our own righteousness, the Pharisee would have had a greatly exaggerated view of his own achievement. Even if it were true that we could get into heaven by having more good deeds than bad deeds, none of us could possibly make it on that basis, because our bad deeds far surpass our good deeds. In fact, we've never done an authentic good deed in our lives. As the apostle said, with a real evaluation of our performance by the law, there's none who does good, no, not one. And we say, wait.
Wow. If you hear that, that is an extreme and really absurd statement. So R.C. Sproul just said, essentially, there is nobody who has done a single good act in his or her entire life. So how is that possible? Because on a number of occasions, even Jesus himself, but not just Jesus, all the prophets, say that there are people doing good deeds. And Jesus says we will be judged by our good deeds and our bad deeds. And he didn't follow it up with, "Oh, psych, you actually can't do good deeds. Everything you do is bad." So I think this is a really extreme and absurd and ridiculous teaching that I don't understand how people take R.C. Sproul and others like him seriously when he says things like that. What is the basis for saying that it's impossible to do a single good deed in your life? And he goes and quotes, of course, the Paul in Romans that says, "None, there is none good, no, not one." Okay, we have a problem on our hands then, because clearly, uh, there are so many theological and scriptural error issues with this. It's hard to know where to begin. Why is God telling us what's good, telling us what's bad? But if we do the things that God says are good, God doesn't judge it as good. Doesn't that make God an unfair judge? Doesn't that make God a deceiver? Why, this is a huge problem with modern Christianity, is how it just distorts and twists the nature of God into some really a maniacal evil dictator who's just arbitrarily judging people's works not according to what they're actually doing, but according to, I guess, their belief system. So, like, if you don't believe the right facts, nothing you do is good. It's no. If you do a good deed, you do a good deed. Doesn't matter if you're an atheist or a Christian or anything in between or anything else. A good deed is a good deed. That doesn't necessarily make you a good person, because you could be doing a lot of bad deeds, but your good deed is seen as a good deed. And to say otherwise is to impugn the character of God, in my opinion. Why is this? Sorry, we're having technical difficulties. I don't know what's going on here. Is this my computer? I think I might have lost it for a second. Hold on. Why is this not working? Is my internet connection? Or did something go? Something's going wrong here. I think I might have lost my internet connector. No. Hold on. Let's try to get this back. Let's try to get this back.
To this man, did I not think it can't be that die?
There we go. Back in action.
Remember, when God considers our acts, he not only considers the act itself, whether it corresponds to his law, but the motivation for it. Did we do this particular work out of a heart that was 100% dedicated to God? We're called as the to love him with all of our hearts, all of our minds, all of our strength. And there's no one of us in this room that has ever loved God with all of his heart in 1 hour or 1 minute of your life. So every deed that we do is always marred by that imperfection of the dedicated heart and will that performs it. So this
So that's an interesting point. So that is, I do agree with that, but that does not mean that humans are incapable of doing good works. Now, I agree, if you do a good work with the wrong motivation, which is possible, you can help someone in order to maybe take advantage of them in some other way. You can try to be manipulating them or some other thing. Then God will see that, and God will basically hold that against you. But it is possible to do good deeds with the intention of just simply helping someone. It doesn't necessarily have to be from a position of selfishness. So they're kind of smuggling in this concept of what's called total depravity, which says that humans are wicked and sinful to the extent that there is no good motivation to what they do. And I think that's just disproven by our common experience. I think, yes, it's true that sometimes people do good things out of a desire to glorify themselves or benefit themselves. But I think it's also possible that humans genuinely want to, in some cases, just help others. Not at all an impossible thing. So I think this is, again, we're getting into some serious error here.
Pharisee was misguided in every regard about his redemption. Now, standing in stark contrast to this man who's boasting of the difference between him and the publican is the publican himself. We read the tax collector standing afar off would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Couldn't even raise his eyes to heaven. One of my favorite hymns is Augustus Toplady's hymn, Rock of Ages. And that passage in the hymn, nothing in my hand I bring. Simply to the cross I cling. The Pharisee brought his fasting in his hand. He brought his tithing in his hand. He brought his status and his standing in the church in his hand. Where the tax collector, his hand was empty. He had nothing to contribute to his own salvation.
So what? God just wants us to believe some stuff and then, not understand that we have to, do good unto others to get into heaven? We should just abandon that idea? So he's motivating people to not do the right thing. He's trying to get you to give up on the idea that you have to do good works to get into heaven. So this is extremely dangerous stuff, actually.
Was a plea for mercy. Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. At least the publican knew who he was and what he was. He wasn't suffering under the delusion of a phony righteousness, such as the Pharisee carried with him every day. What this is about the only hope and the only ground for justification, which is found in perhaps the most important theological concept in history, the concept of imputation.
So here we have R.C Sproul saying the most important theological concept, perhaps, in history is imputation. Now, I need to do a study on imputation to show what a truly, I'll just say that maybe a truly, and I've already used this word before, so I hesitate to use it again, but dangerous idea imputation is. A dangerous, destructive, horrible, unjust idea called imputation. It is not a great idea. It is a really terrible idea. It's an unjust idea. And I can't remember if R.C. Sproul defined imputation. I think he does. We'll let R.C. Sproul define imputation, and then we'll discuss it. Because we need to understand that the doctrine of imputation is something that really destroys the Christian faith in so many ways. And it needs to be rejected, needs to be defeated. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say. It looks like sometimes this doesn't want to start up again, so we have to kind of why it's doing this. This is really annoying. We'll get it back under so. We will get it back. I don't know if it was my internet or what. Ugh, this is really annoying. Why is this not working?
Even if it were true perfectly in history.
There it is.
The concept of imputation. The concept of imputation means that our justification in the presence of God is founded and grounded on a righteousness that is not our own.
So there it is. Imputation is the idea that our righteousness, our justification before God, is founded on a righteousness that is not our own. So how is that just for God to judge us by another person's righteousness? That's exactly how R.C. Sproul just defined imputation. And imputation is a major doctrine within modern Christianity. And he's not wrong. It's central to the idea of Christianity today that we be imputed with the perfect righteousness of Christ. But the problem is that this is mythology. It's nonsense. It's a concocted, made up, false idea that strikes at the very character and nature of God in so many ways. So this is why I wanted to show people what's going on with modern Christianity and why it's so distorted and warped. What is being taught to people is disastrous for themselves and for society and for the truth. Imputation must be understood as a dangerous and destructive doctrine.
It's what Luther called a justitium alienum, an alien righteousness, a righteousness extra nos, a righteousness outside of ourselves, a righteousness accomplished only by Christ, the only one who ever kept the law perfectly throughout his life. And sometimes we ask the 6-year-old child in Sunday school, what did Jesus do for you? And the child will say, he died on the cross for my sin, and that's true. But had Jesus just come down from heaven on Good Friday and gone to Golgotha and took your sin upon him and paid the price before a holy God, would that have been enough to redeem you? The answer is no. That would have been enough to take away your guilt. That would have been enough to remove your punishment. But what it wouldn't do would be to supply you with the righteousness that God requires from every human being. That's why Jesus had to be born. He had to live under the law. He had to do what we call a life of perfect active obedience, so that in his obedience he accrued for himself perfect righteousness. And it's that righteousness that is then transferred to the account of every person who puts their trust in him and in him alone. And as long as that Pharisee trusted that much in his own righteousness, he couldn't possibly be redeemed. I remember.
All right, think about what R.C. Sproul just said. If the Pharisee trusted in his own righteousness that much, and obviously he's talking about whatsoever, he could not be redeemed or whatever, or justified, or whatever the term he used was. So what R.C. Sproul, as a popular Christian teacher, is saying is that you must necessarily, in order to be saved, abandon the idea that you must be righteous to enter heaven. You cannot believe that your righteousness contributes to your salvation. Now, the danger of that is beyond is infinite, because that is exactly how we will be judged. We will be judged based on our own righteousness. We will be judged based on not a foreign righteousness, as the false teachers want to say, but we will stand before God with our own righteousness. There will be no imputation of righteousness. God is not going to impute a foreign righteousness to us, because that would be unjust. Why is it just for God to say, you know what? You weren't righteous. You were a murderer. You were a thief. You were a liar. You stole. You violated women. You did all these terrible things in your life. But you know what? Jesus, he obeyed me. My son obeyed me. So what I'm going to do, as long as you believe that my son died for your sins, I'm going to impute you, you wicked, evil person, with the perfect righteousness of Christ. How is that a just thing for God to do? Doesn't that make God a respecter of persons? This is a huge problem. And when you abandon the idea that your righteousness contributes to is necessary for your salvation, what you're basically saying is you don't have to be righteous to get into heaven. So what's the limit? How sinful can you be? Well, apparently infinitely sinful. And what does sin do? Sin is what causes suffering in this world. So what the whole purpose of Jesus Christ coming to earth was to eliminate sin. But what was the mechanism by which that would occur? The mechanism was by the teaching of the truth, training people to see the divine plan, establishing a church that would allow people to put these ideas into practice in their lives, so that over time people would use their free will to stop sinning, and thereby ending suffering on this earth, at least as resulting from sinful activities. And that's causes a great deal of suffering, so most of it would go away. And what do the modern Christian teachers do? They turn it into the complete opposite and say, you know what? No, your righteousness has nothing to do with Christianity. At least in the ultimate sense. Yeah, you can do it if you want, but it's not the central factor. That's not true. It's everything. Your righteousness is everything. It's the whole basis of what happens in this world and what happens in the next world. And they're saying that this parable is what's teaching this, is the fascinating part. We will get to that. I will get to the parable, but I just want people to understand what's being taught here and why Christians are being led very far astray from the truth. And it's not just R.C. Sproul. I'm highlighting R.C. Sproul because he's articulating the idea very clearly. But you will get this sermon in just about any church in America. Maybe not a Catholic church or an Eastern Orthodox church, but the evangelical churches, which makes up, I would say, a majority of Christians in this country, this is the message you're getting. You better not believe you have to be righteous, otherwise you're not trusting in Christ. Even though Christ himself taught that our righteousness is necessary to get into heaven. So they're corrupting everything.
My mentor giving a sermon in a church one day on the radical ravages of sin. And after the service, this dear, sweet little old lady came up to him and said, Dr. Gerstner, you've made me feel that big. And he looked at her and smiled and he said, ma'am, that's too much. He said, that's much too much. Don't you know that much self-righteousness will send you to hell forever? If you're trusting in your accomplishments, in your goodness, in your works, you're no different from this Pharisee who went home to his house unjustified. The one who went home to his house justified was the one who rested on grace and on grace alone. Now, what is this mercy of justification. And what was this publican looking for? The very essence of justification, dear friends, is forgiveness. What happens in justification is that God pronounces a person just who in himself is not just.
Did anyone hear that? Did y'all just hear what he just said? Let's play that back again.
But with that pronouncement, publican looking for. The very essence of justification, dear friends, is forgiveness. What happens in justification is that God pronounces a person just who in himself is not just.
Wow. See, I had to listen to that again. What R.C. Sproul just said is that what happens in justification is that God pronounces a person just who in and of himself is not just. That is a startling and disturbing thing to say. How can we trust a God like that? How can that be the Christian God? Because that makes God unjust. And that means God is declaring people to be something that they're not. This makes God a liar. But it makes people feel good, because you know why? Because they're going to be declared completely righteous, even though they don't have to be righteous. You know what? Being righteous in this world is more difficult than being unrighteous, because when you're unrighteous, you can do whatever you want. You can live according to however you want, but being righteous requires that you abide by a standard outside of yourself. So this is why this message is so appealing to people. Because just like the atheists who say there is no objective morality, this allows people to pretend that they can live however they want and still get into heaven, because they're going to be declared just by God, even though they're not. So how is this not just moral relativism? This is no better than atheism. None. In fact, this is worse. Because they're hiding the truth. They're not rejecting the truth. They're hiding it. They're making it seem like they are the ones teaching the path to God, when they are actually the ones turning into the complete opposite of the truth. Ryan Apologetics. People can pervert any verse or parable. The parable still has important things to take away. Essentially, whoever exalts... Yeah, exactly, Ryan. Will be exalted is a verbatim statement in 4 and 5 different verses. In line with Jesus, call yourself unworthy. Yeah, no, I agree. That's why I'm trying to get people to understand that this idea, because as I said in the beginning, not everyone was here. They are trying to teach this parable as if it's teaching faith alone doctrine. So let's just finish this, and then we'll get to the analysis of the parable itself.
But with that pronouncement, grants the remission of sin. That person's sin is removed. It's taken away. It's sent into the outer darkness. It's buried in the sea of forgetfulness as far as the east is from the west. And when it says that this publican went to his house justified, it meant this: he went to his house forgiven. When Paul deals with this doctrine of justification in Romans, after he explains it all, he says, therefore, being justified, that is, justification is something that's already taken place, we have peace with God and access into his presence. The Pharisee had status, but he was still at war with God. He was still an unforgiven person. And as long as a person is trusting in their own righteousness, they can never experience that grace of sin that is removed and forgiveness that is received. But again, the publican, he had nothing to claim. The only merit he had before God was demerit. All he had to bring before God was his sin. And he knew that he was a sinner. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus said, he went home, an adopted son of God. He went home forgiven. He went to his house justified. And then Jesus warns all of us who hear this parable that those who exalt themselves will be humbled. But those who humble themselves will be exalted.
That was R.C Sproul on this Tuesday edition of Renewing Your Mind from his series.
All right, and there you have it, folks. So I feel like that was a very important exposition of the common evangelical understanding of not just this parable, but Christianity in general. You better not believe you have to be righteous. God's not gonna declare you righteous if you actually think you have to be righteous. That's because that means you're not trusting in Christ alone, which is obviously absurd. But I hear people bring up this parable so many times in an effort to prove that all we have to do is believe Jesus is condemning works righteousness and salvation, that I thought it would be productive to actually study it and look at it and help people understand that, first of all, that makes no sense because it would lead to Jesus contradicting himself everywhere else. But to show that this parable in and of itself just does not teach that. And it's not a good idea. It's not healthy to believe what the common Christian teachers are saying to us. Let's read this and quickly discuss why these people are wrong. This parable is not teaching faith alone. It's not teaching that it's not condemning works righteousness salvation. Obviously, these are corrupted, invalid interpretations, but let's just kind of read through it for a second. So it's in Luke chapter 18, starting in verse 9. And he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying to himself, God, I thank you that I'm not like the other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you that this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. So in the beginning of this parable and at the end, we see the true meaning of this parable. It's not that the Pharisee was trusting in his good works, and then that meant that he was thinking he's a good person. And if you think you're a good person, it actually means you're no. None of that. The problem is, it's right here. The moral of the story, as they say, is that the Pharisee was exalting himself and inflating his own ego and basically doing these things in order to basically glorify his own self. Now, you can obey God without glorifying yourself. So let's read this. The ending here. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. So we're seeing here, gosh, go away. I really hate how I want to see how do you get rid of this little thing that pops up? Because all it does is when I highlight something, it just blocks what I'm trying to show. It's so stupid. Let's see if I really wish that wouldn't happen. Anyways, let's just do it this way. So if you read right here, humbling yourself, you're supposed to be humble. Now, thinking that you can be a good person and obey God does not mean you're exalting yourself. Exalting yourself is doing that with the idea of being seen as good in the eyes of human beings. So if you want to basically enhance your own reputation in this world, you can do good things and then kind of show off and say, look at all the great things I'm doing. And there are a lot of benefits that come with that. In fact, a lot of very corrupt politicians do this. I won't name names, but they run off the idea that they are the holy ones. They are the ones who are essentially good people. And what do they get for that? They get power, they get fame, they get money, they can funnel the taxpayer money to their own accounts, and because when you control the political offices, you control the money essentially in society, and they find ways to basically reroute it to themselves, as we've been learning to a very great extent in the United States in the last couple months. What we found is that, and again, this is a little bit of a diversion, but it's worth noting that in the United States, something that has been revealed by this current presidential administration is that a lot of the tax money we've been sending up there has just been completely just abused and used for ridiculous reasons. And not just ridiculous reasons, but the people who were, and a lot of people knew this. This isn't something that's, new to the United States or even the last few months. But the extent to which it is happening is shocking a lot of people. That all this really literally trillions and trillions of dollars was just being blown by these politicians who were finding ways to basically enrich themselves and their friends. And the media is supposed in America is acting like this is horrible, that all these what the media is trying to lie to people and say is that basically people should be upset that these bad actors have access to all this information and are kind of controlling it for them. No, the problem is they don't want to admit, because they're the ones benefiting from it, that the money is being wasted. And I only say that because it's to highlight the benefit that you can get from people thinking that you're a savior or a saint or something like that. They entrust you with things, and then you can therefore go and abuse that power. And that's something that anyone can do. So there are reasons to pretend like you're a good person and hope that other people see that. It can be motivated by selfishness. And that's what the Pharisees did. And Jesus often spoke of this. Jesus often spoke to them as basically people who did everything for show. They did everything to accumulate power for themselves, to manipulate and wield power over society. So really nothing has changed in 2,000 years, or really since the beginning of time. This is what corrupt human beings do. It's what the evil people do. They get in positions of power in the government, however they may look. In Jesus' time, it was a theocracy, but in our time, it's a democracy. Whatever the case may be, they find their ways into the positions of power and they exploit it. And they use it to bolster themselves, their own reputations, their own bank accounts, whatever it may be. And that is what's going on here. This is what the Pharisee is doing. This is the real problem with the Pharisee. It's not that he's trying to obey God. The problem is that he's not obeying God because he's not doing what he's doing for the love of God. And if we go up here to the beginning, we read verse 9. And he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. And the faith alone types will stop right there. You see, they trusted in their own righteousness. They thought they could be good people. They thought that they could obey God's law. And Jesus is about to bring the hammer down on them. No, it's not simply that they trusted in their own righteousness. And by the way, you can trust in your own righteousness and not be righteous. All right. So Jesus didn't say these people were trying to obey God, They thought they had to obey God's law, and that's going to get them in big trouble with their justification. No, that is not what's being said here. What if you read the whole verse? It says what? And he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they are righteous and viewed others with contempt. So again, we see this issue of the ego being inflated. They are actually self-righteous. This is a dangerous mindset to have when it leads to you viewing others with contempt. So it's the combination of the two. It's viewing yourself as being righteous, leading to you having contempt for your fellow human beings. So what does Jesus teach us? That we need to love our neighbors, which basically means to basically view others as being worthy of dignity and respect. So if you're obeying God and it leads to you having a contemptuous view of other beings, you're doing it wrong. But what is obviously not being taught here is that we shouldn't try to obey God. No. The problem with the Pharisee here is that he has this elevated view of himself. He's become egotistical. He's doing everything for himself. He's doing everything to feel in his own self that he is the greater human being inherently than the other ones. And by the way, but humbling yourself is a work. It's something that you do. So you have to humble yourself for God to exalt you. Now God will humble you, but what that means is God will bring about the circumstances in your life that will humble you. Now whether you actually become humble is up to you. Because sometimes something can happen to you that might be a message from God, but you don't get the message. And it actually leaves you worse. So the moral of the story here, we have to be humble. Now, the antinomians and the faith alone types will say, the second you think that you can obey God's law, you are not being humble. That is incorrect. Why would God give us a law to follow, a law to guide us, and then turn around and condemn us for thinking that we have to obey that law or that we can obey that law? So God's sitting there telling us that this law is going to bring you life. This law is going to be a light unto your feet. This law is going to be everything good. It's going to be it's going to be a reflection of my very holy nature. But if you think for 1 second that you can actually obey this law and that you have to obey this law, I'm going to condemn you because you're an arrogant, prideful fool to think that you can obey my law. Does that sound like something a just and fair God would do? That sounds like a psychotic and evil God to me. And this is why common sense is so necessary when you're reading these passages. The people argue with me, oh, why do you put logic before the Bible? Because if you don't use logic, you're not going to interpret the verses properly. You have to have good logic before you can. This is how Christianity becomes so corrupt. People aren't using logic. They're reading the words, and they trusted in their own righteousness. I guess that means we can't believe we have to be righteous. Turn their brains off right away. It's bizarre. No, God is not that silly. God is not that nonsensical to give us a law, tell us how good the law is, tell us how holy the law is, and then turn around and condemn us for thinking that we need to obey the law. It's bizarre that anyone would think that way. Those people need to be held accountable because they also herd a lot of Christians. I think you might mean that because they are being heard by a lot of Christians. Because by then supporting... Okay, I think this is a reference to something I said earlier. Because by then supporting Trump blindly and cheering for them, and even being dumb enough to put him in office a second time after what he did in wasting $8 trillion, they are accountable. Well, I think this is a little more complicated than you're trying to say, Chris. Because I don't think Trump was the one who wasted the money. I think that a lot of the money was in place before Trump ever came along. And that's a conversation. Maybe I'll have a political stream at some point. Maybe I'll do that tomorrow, where I'll actually discuss kind of what's going on politically in this country. We can discuss whether Trump is doing the right thing or not. I think that'll be an interesting discussion. Yeah. All right. So I think I've given my interpretation. Let me see here. If anyone has any questions about what I've said, I welcome that at this time. But I use R.C. Sproul's sermon as a basis for people understanding like $45 billion would fix all the piping and water in America and save many more lives over the long run. And yeah, I agree. I think Trump is trying to do that. I think Trump is trying to reroute the money to be more effectively used. Because clearly under the Biden administration, it wasn't being effectively used. They're finding all kinds of fraud and waste that's just incomprehensible to the average person. Literally trillions of dollars were being wasted. Just wasted. Not even used for anything. So much fraud and waste, it's sickening. But the reason I play the R.C. Sproul sermon is so that I can justify myself in saying that when I say that people are teaching these doctrines out there, I'm not making it up. You can listen to R.C. Sproul, and I think people know that, but there might be someone out there who'd be like, no, nobody's saying. Yes, popular Christian teachers are saying these things. They are saying that you have to abandon belief in your own righteousness in order to be saved. As shocking and as silly and as absurd as that might sound, that is exactly what R.C. Sproul and many others say. And it's obviously the exact opposite of true Christianity. And I wanted people to understand that and see that so that I can essentially say that, no, I'm not making up what I'm saying. And also for people to understand that this parable, I guess ultimately, this parable doesn't teach what they're saying it's teaching. This parable teaches exactly what I believe, which is that works righteousness is necessary for salvation. Because humbling yourself is something that we do. That is something that comes from our own righteousness. Having a humble attitude comes from within ourselves. We need to build that within ourselves. We need to basically manifest that idea or that quality of being humble. So I'll give it a few more minutes. If no one has any disputes or questions, then I will close down the stream. You would have to be really stupid not to think Trump was involved because he signed his... No, well, actually, no, I don't believe that's true because a lot of the spending in Washington is basically preset. And you really can't effectively change it because of how the Senate has the filibuster rule. So unless you have the Congress, see, Chris, according to our system, the money is allocated by Congress. So you have to, first of all, have a Congress that's going to change the laws of spending to change. But so there are certain things Trump can do, but only within the bounds of the executive branch. So if Congress doesn't bring a law to him changing how the spending is done, then there's not a whole lot he can do. He can reveal the fraud, but as we're seeing with there's judges all over the country that are hamstringing him, and of course they're Democrat-appointed judges. They're trying to make the case that he can't cut this funding because he doesn't have the executive branch doesn't have that authority. So this is exactly what I'm saying, Chris. Is that even though Trump is president, his authority is limited. So to say that Trump is singularly responsible for something is inaccurate. Now, the reason you can say the problem is more Biden than Trump is because Biden wasn't doing anything about it. Biden was apparently perfectly happy with the way things are going. Trump is the only one that's actually seems to be at least highlighting the issue and showing what a huge problem it is. What I'm saying is if he would have done a cost-benefit analysis before spending $8 trillion on COVID, we would see that by merely investing into other things, you could save more lives. I mean, I've never seen that we spent $8 trillion on COVID alone. That might be true, but again, Chris, this is something that I think I've discussed with you, is that you have to realize, first of all, Trump has brought people into his current administration who have a very skeptical view of vaccines. So if that's kind of your issue, then I don't understand why you're at least more supportive of what Trump is doing. Now, can everything that we want to have done happen immediately? No, because we're fighting people who are resisting what's going on. So the point is, Trump is making an effort to go in the right direction. Now, whether he accomplishes it or not is up to whether he'll be able to overcome the people who are entrenched in the system, who still have quite a bit of power. So saying that Trump is part of the problem kind of ignores the fact that Trump is, at least according to what I would assume is your perspective, he's at least moving things in the right direction. But again, maybe tomorrow I'll host a stream, Chris, and we can, because that really wasn't. That was more of a side point I made. I'm not really trying to defend the Trump administration right now. I was just trying to make a point that, when people get in government power, when they're running for office, and you can make this case for Trump as well. I'm not saying it's not Trump. A lot of times they'll present themselves as really great people, and they'll say all the great things they want to do, but in the back of their minds, what they really want to do is control society for their own benefit. And that's what happens when you appear righteous, but you're exalting yourself. You're exalting yourself for personal benefit and gain. And that's what the Pharisees did, and that's what Jesus was condemning. Jesus wasn't condemning people who are trying to be righteous. No, that's silly. I don't understand why anyone would even say that. Well, I do get it, but because they don't want to be accountable to their own actions ultimately. But that's not what Jesus was doing. What Jesus was doing was he was saying that those people were exalting themselves to benefit from it personally. That's what self-righteousness is. There's a big difference between righteousness and self-righteous. You can be righteous without being self-righteous. Absolutely. So but I wouldn't have a problem hosting a politics stream for people who want to disagree with, because I thought about talking about politics many times. But I get so concerned about what's going on in Christianity that I almost always end up focusing on that, because I really feel like Christianity, the way it currently manifests itself, is a huge problem. Because first of all, it's supposed to be the vessel by which everyone obeys God, but it's turned into something where it's literally the exact opposite. It's become something that turns people away from the truth of God. People need to recognize that, because a lot of people out there are looking for the truth. And when they finally come to a point in their lives where they're finally like, okay, I want to obey God, I want to know what God wants from me, they don't have anywhere to go. They don't have any truth. So Christianity needs to be reformed so that there's a basis for truth and righteousness in society. And that's exactly why I do what I do, to get Christians to realize they're in a false system. They're being misled. That we do need to obey God. That's the whole idea behind Christianity. It's necessary for our salvation and all these things. So, all right, not seeing any more questions or disputes or engagements, so I'm going to shut down the stream. But if you watch the stream and you appreciated what I have to say, please like and subscribe if that's something you want to do, if you think you could benefit it. I don't want to hear you because you're just emotional. You're a lying, lawless piece of crap who's just like everybody else. Because of Obama signed legislation that caused people $8 trillion, you would blame it on Obama. But suddenly if Trump signs that, you don't want to blame it on him. Well, the difference is, Chris, that Obama, the mindset of the liberals and the left is to go in that socialist direction. Now, Trump has to decide what he signs because Congress is the one who draws up the laws. Okay. So this is actually how our system works. Now, Trump has said many times that now if Trump doesn't sign the law, then people will blame him for basically being an obstructionist. So at some level, you do have to work within the mentality of the current. So that's why we have to work against the people who are obstructing this agenda, the MAGA agenda, Chris. Thank you, Freddie. Thank you for being here. Because I think it's kind of bullcrap that he wouldn't listen to Protestant doctors I know and only Catholic doctors like Tony Fauci and his corrupt Catholic CDC director, which he appointed. Well, see, that's interesting, Chris, because RFK Jr. is an anti-vax skeptic. So what do you want him to do? Put someone in there who's pro-vax? RFK Jr. was the one saying that the vaccines are causing problems. So you're just going in there. You're saying that you're opposed to the COVID situation, okay? But Trump, you can't give Trump credit for putting someone in there who supports your mindset. This is what I don't get about you. So what is Trump supposed to do? Put someone in there who's pro-vax? Chris, you have to see again, you're not getting it. Trump is limited by the people who are in. Trump has to operate within the framework in which he's elected. Right now, the Senate Republicans are weak. They are the ones who confirm Trump's cabinet appointments. If Trump nominates someone who they don't like, which in that first term, it was a much different cultural environment, then they won't get approved. So Bill Barr was someone that Mitch McConnell would approve in the Senate. You have to realize the Republicans didn't have a large majority at the time. So this is very simple to understand. I don't see what the problem is. I'm a real Republican. Unlike Trump, I actually run for office. The truth of God does not need a label. It is evident in nature, perceived uniquely by each human. You know what I'll do for about? Let's see. I'll post the link. And if someone wants to join for a few minutes, then that is something we can do. Let's try to keep it on message. Let's try to keep it about the topic on hand. Give people a couple minutes to see if they want to join. Excuse me. I know I just said I would shut down the stream, but it looked like more engagement came in, so I didn't want to hit and run, as they say. So I pinned the link. I know a lot of people that were hurt by Trump's vaccine. I was out there trying to have rallies telling Trump not to keep renewing the emergency order. I see Trump. What's my view on this? Oh, so yeah, I agree. Yeah, God is beyond religion, Pratik. So, but religions form to kind of consolidate ideas about God. But yeah, if no religion existed, then, the idea of God would still stand on its own. But, how it's perceived, how humans perceive things may not necessarily be true. You see what I'm saying? So it's not really what we perceive, it's what's ultimately true. Right, Chris. You realize, see, Every 9 days, Trump has to sign an emergency order to maintain lockdown going on. If he doesn't sign, yeah, Trump ended the lockdowns. I don't know if you noticed that. Trump ended the lockdowns. The Biden was the one who got in there and tried to fire everybody in the country who didn't get the vaccine. You think Trump would have done that? Trump said he wouldn't do it. Trump was the one who said he would not fire people even during the 2020 election cycle. Trump was saying that he wanted people to have their own choice whether or not to get the vaccine. Biden was the one who said, well, I guess Biden lied. He said he wasn't going to fire everybody, but then he ended up doing it. So again, Chris, you have to realize we're limited to the choices who are before us. Nobody's perfect, but one is better than the other, and you can't say Trump is for something when he's against it. Streaks through chat. This is why God gives us intelligence. We got Vaughn Eric here. Good to see you. Reread that because I'm not defending Obama. What I'm saying is Ace Philosophy is a dishonest person because if Obama signed the same kind of legislation, he would say that Obama was guilty. No, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. Again, you have to ask, what is their ultimate goal? What is their ultimate agenda? And if you're focusing on the vaccines, then remember Trump signed this just like when Obama signed for his health care. We hold Obama accountable for Obamacare. We should hold Trump accountable for warp speed, especially when he keeps bragging. Yeah, I agree, but I still think that Trump was the better of the options for someone like your perspective. It's not like you were going to get a better deal with Biden because we obviously learned that we wouldn't. So what, you think it's better that Biden got in there and tried to force the vaccines on the entire country to make it a requirement to get a job when Trump said he wasn't going to do that? It's absurd. And qualities like polite intelligence, subconscious, etc. Yeah, God gave us intelligence. God gave us a rational mind. Exactly, Pratik. I'm not in disagreement with you at all. I'm not in disagreement with you at all. Yeah, I think people should use their reason way more when it comes to thinking about God and philosophy and things like that. Yeah, God exists outside of the religion of Christianity. The question is, does Christianity teach the truth about God? Does whatever religion teach the truth about God? You know? Because multiple religions can teach the truth about God, and there are religions who can teach false ideas about God, like Islam. And not everything about Islam is false, but a lot of things that Islam says is false. So there's a little bit of truth in everything, and there's different degrees of falsehood in everything. The key is to focus on the truth and exclude the untrue things. Yeah, so maybe tomorrow, maybe tomorrow we'll have maybe not tomorrow. Maybe at some point in the near future, I'll hold a politics stream so that Chris Lucas can get it all out of his system. Because I really, or not just Chris Lucas, but I think it's worth kind of discussing the cultural matters as well. I don't want to become a one-trick pony where I just talk about Christianity all day, every day. There's nothing wrong with that, but I just think there are a lot of other topics that are really important. I think politics is really important because I think what happens in this world is important. I think what happens to us in eternity is based on what happens to us, what happens in this finite world in which we live. So to get eternity, we have to get the non-eternal correct, and we have to create the basis for a prosperous society in this world, so that truth can flourish and people can live to their full potential. And that involves selecting the right politicians to run society. If we don't have good politicians, then we're going to get a society where we can't live our full lives, we can't live our full potential, and that's a horrible thing. So maybe we'll do that. We'll try to have a politics stream and analyze what's going on in first of all America, but perhaps elsewhere around the world as well. All right, looks like no one's going to join. I hope this stream was beneficial, productive. Like I said before, please like and subscribe. Most importantly, subscribe if you want to. If you think that my information is educational, beneficial, productive. Thank everyone who showed up. 13 above, Pratik, Chris Lucas. You just ended yours, Freddie? Yeah. I just had a little short stream. I just wanted to get this one out of my system. I've been hearing so many of the faith alone types talk about this parable that I thought I would do a little study on it, show them that they're wrong, for those who want to pay attention, or for anyone else who wants to see that they're wrong. So, all right, the job is done. So thank you all. Like I said, subscribe. Continue to think these things. And I will see you all next time. God bless.